Good morning or afternoon or evening, everyone, depending on where you are. And welcome to the next session of GTR MENA Virtual 2021. My name is Simon Cook and I'll be moderating this session. I'm a partner at Sullivan Law Firm based in London. I've been working in the Middle East Africa area for about 20 years now and have spent a number of years living and working in Dubai, where I was pleased to say the Africa business was booming at the time. It's been an interesting 2021 for trade flows around the world. The pandemic has had a serious effect, and it'll be interesting to see what 2021 holds for world trade. In this session, we'll be looking at, in particular, the volumes and the flows on the South-South corridor from Africa, Middle East, and through to Asia. We'll be looking at where the opportunities may lie, what sectors seem to be doing better than others, and what regions are doing well. Now, there'll be a role for lots of different types of institutions. It's not just lenders, borrowers, and traders. Governments can also play an important role, and we'll be looking at how they can all help to try and increase flows through the corridor. We'll also be looking at the sources of finance, what sort of products are available, and how we can increase flows over the coming years. We have an excellent group of panelists for you today, comprising corporates, lenders, government-related trade associations. And so I think we should get a really diverse set of opinions and hopefully some interesting information. So before we start, just a few housekeeping issues. We'll be running the session with a very brief couple of slides to set the scene for the discussion. We'll then move into the panel discussion. Feel free to raise questions. There's a Q&A button on your platform, or you can raise questions in the chat and they'll be forwarded through. And we'll raise them as they come in. If you could say who they are directed at, if they are directed at anyone in particular, that would be very helpful. So without further ado, what I'd like to do is invite the panelists to each introduce themselves, and then we'll move on with the session. Judy, perhaps I could start with you.
Well, good afternoon from a beautiful Johannesburg. I send you warm African greetings from a world-class African city. My name is Judy Nokedi, and I am the former chair of the Indian Ocean Rim Association Business Forum. But when I'm not doing multilateral work, I work in the energy sector. I've cut my teeth in the nuclear industry and in broadcasting, mainly infrastructure at that scale. And currently, I am an independent non-executive director for the Consolidated Infrastructure Group. And that particular group works across the continent from Nigeria to Ethiopia to West Africa to Southern Africa. And I also have I have equity in a tourism infrastructure group. It's called Tourvest Integrated Tourism. And of course, so I'm in two sectors that have been quite severely hit by COVID. Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Judy. Moji, perhaps I can come to you now.
Good afternoon from an African sat in the locked down city of London. My name is Moji Hampanuwasu, and I'm the founder of Woodhull Capital, a financial advisory firm that helps facilitate the flow of international funding into the continent of Africa. Thank you.
Thanks, Moji. And then Jay.
Hi, good afternoon all. This is Jay. That's my short name, but the full name is Mrityunjay. I'm responsible for trade products in Abu Dhabi Commercial Bank. With 23 years of trade finance experience in the region and globally in India, Australia, and subcontinent, I bring in a lot of trade finance experience to the group. Looking forward to having an interaction. Thank you so much.
Many thanks, Jay. And then last but by no means least, Robert.
Thank you, Simon. Hello, everyone, and good afternoon also from a warm, balmy South Africa. My name is Robert Besseling. I am the CEO of Pangea Risk. Pangea Risk is a specialist risk intelligence company focused on providing analysis and forecasts on political, security, and economic risk in both Africa and the Middle East. And because we have created that scan between the two regions, I'm looking forward to commenting on this South-South trade corridor that Simon was already describing. Thank you for having me.
Thanks very much, Robert. As I mentioned, we're going to set the scene with a couple of slides that Robert is going to take us through with some interesting facts and figures before moving into the panel discussion. So Robert, over to you.
Thank you again, Simon. Yeah, I've put a few slides together just as setting the scene to this topic, which of course is often discussed, yet seems to be changing on a very quick, very swift basis. South-South trade in the context of GTR-MENA usually looks at the Middle East as a hub for trade and investment flowing from Asia, China and India and other countries to the African continent and vice versa. And this is, of course, certainly something which has been highlighted by the Belt and Road Initiative. As you can see from this infographic here, it's been a real push from China, very often through the Middle East or directly into the African continent. India has been using the Middle East specifically as a hub for trade and investment and for special investment vehicles. Interestingly, for example, I mentioned the BRI, which tries to connect Chinese ports through the Middle East in places like the UAE and Oman to East African ports in Somalia, Kenya, and elsewhere. However, I'm interested to also talk about the opportunity at hand here. And this is very much because over the past year, obviously, we've seen a number of Middle East and African countries suffer due to the pandemic and associated economic and political knock-on effects. Indeed, last year, we rated most of sub-Saharan Africa's countries, about 80%, in a severe or high risk rating. And this is, of course, because Africa fell into recession for the first time in 25 years, with all the country risk implications that holds. However, now, as we look forward to 2021, and as Simon has already highlighted, the optimism behind that around vaccine, economic recovery, and potential restoration of trade flows and investments, we've seen the country risk outlook significantly improve in Africa as well as the Middle East. And this also opens up a potential other avenue to interpret South-South trade. Rather than seeing the Middle East only as a hub for Asia-Africa and Africa-Asia, the Middle East is now directly engaging in Africa and becoming an increasingly more important player. Let's take the example of the UAE, for example, where GTR-MENA is usually hosted. The UAE, I think, has a record of about 26 double taxation agreements between its Emirates and African countries. Similarly, just 3 years ago, the UAE was Africa's 5th largest investor in terms of the number of projects, jobs, and capital invested. And then 2 years ago, UAE actually became Africa's 4th largest investor, replacing or displacing South Africa on this list, and is now the 2nd largest investor in Africa in terms of projects after China. Now, this of course shows the drive in terms of incentives and double taxation agreements is working to establish the UAE and other Middle Eastern countries as this direct hub. For the UAE specifically, this has been, of course, built around aviation and also around the dominance that companies like DP World have in terms of orchestrating trade and operating ports around the African continent, from Algeria in the north to Maputo in the south, and from Senegal in the west to particularly the Horn of Africa. And this is also where we're seeing other players, particularly Qatari and Turkish interests, competing with the Emirates over the operation of different ports. And this, of course, is bringing major windfall investments to some of the continent's least developed nations and boosting trade. And maybe on a final note, I wanted to mention that it's not just the UAE. Saudi Arabia has, for many years, taken a very strong stance on investing in energy and agricultural assets through companies like Aqua Power or Saudi Star, or indeed Saudi Arab. And Qatar has become increasingly active through its main companies like Qatar Gas and Qatar Airways. And Turkey, for example. Turkey is currently trying to sign a new trade agreement with Ethiopia, and is now the second largest investor in a country like Ethiopia. So there's a real push from the Middle East to act directly rather than a gateway hub. And I think I'm going to leave there and open up back to the panel and hand over to you, Simon, because I'm sure we want to address quite a few of these topics and others as well during this session. So thank you already.
Thanks very much, Robert. And yes, we will be touching on a number of those issues throughout the panel. I just wanted to pick up, before going any further, though, on one of the areas that I think is important to look at, and that's the different sectors and different countries and regions that are likely to do well going forwards. And historically, if you talk to people about what the flows are between the Middle East and Africa, say, then typically it's revolved around agri and oil, whether that's oil investment on the way in, agri on the way out, or in oil's case, perhaps vice versa. But there are lots of other potential opportunities. And what I'd like to do is look at where some of those may lie and pick up on the slides that you made, Rob, and ask which areas you think outside of agri and oil are most likely to develop over the coming years.
Thanks, Simon. Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. From an historical perspective, it's been the expertise that Gulf companies have in power and energy, which has led them to establish a foothold on the African continent. And similarly, the need for food security, particularly for countries like Saudi Arabia and Qatar, which have been active in Africa for several generations, particularly in places like Sudan, Ethiopia, Tanzania, where Saudi investments go back 20 or 25 years. But it's now opening up to a whole array of different sectors as well, and particularly driven for the need for establishing relations on fintech and digitization. If you look at Dubai and the ADGM in Abu Dhabi, for example, you can see a number of startups, or an increasing number of startups, collaborating with the African continent on fintech and digitization. Other industries as well are booming. Military and defense, where a number of African countries are seeking to collaborate with the Gulf defense sector, and also procuring weapon systems from the Gulf. And then beyond there as well, the big sector to talk about, I'm sure we will do, is infrastructure. And much of this has focused over the past few years on water infrastructure. And one particularly interesting project there, potentially, is the Great Green Wall, where a lot of opportunity for expertise in water infrastructure from the Gulf can be going into the Sahel region in Africa. So you can really see many more sectors becoming more involved in Africa from the Gulf Middle East region.
It's interesting. I mentioned earlier that I spent a number of years living in Dubai. And when I was there, it's funny because they were actually in the Middle East getting a lot of defense and military training from elsewhere, but particularly UK and Europe. So it seems to have shifted more. And they've sort of, obviously there's been that transfer of knowledge and expertise, which they're now using to build up their own flows into other regions, which is I think a welcome development. I'd like to move on to you, Judy, now, and very topically to do with the pandemic that's going on. Certainly one area which I only recently became aware of as being something being developed on the continent revolves around the whole pharma sector. Perhaps you'd like to say a few words on that.
Yes, I will. And I think, as we move more into a digitized, connected world, the real power lies in data. And I don't mean gigabytes here. I mean knowledge. And so, of course, building on the last comments around the expertise in the Middle East and in UAE, it's really how do we now collaborate and work together. But I think what is very important for me to share with the audience, that the 6-in-1 hexavalent pediatric vaccine is manufactured in South Africa. This is the most powerful vaccine that ensures that children live. This vaccine prevents childhood diseases like diphtheria, tetanus, pertussis, hepatitis B, Polio, and that is a company in Cape Town in South Africa. And this is a company that we are heavily vested in to produce potentially the vaccine over and above what J&J AstraZeneca is doing, etc., but where we can produce a vaccine in South Africa for the continent and, of course, to export. Ghana, very interestingly, driven by a woman, she opened up one of the most successful pharmaceutical factories. So there too, you can see that it's not only the future around the preservation of lives is around, do you have the drugs? So at the moment, most of the APIs are imported, your active pharmaceutical ingredients, but also when you look at hospital infrastructure. So I'd like to say there is a unique opportunity to build better for the future. The UAE is very familiar with one of South Africa's other leading technologies. It is the Lodox machine. And this machine, homegrown African IP, South African IP, is used in all your ICU and trauma centers across the world. This scanner takes 13 seconds. So you can Lodox, that's what you say. You Lodox the patient, and in 13 seconds, you can do an accurate full body overview, which allows your trauma specialist to go to that part of the body that will actually kill you, as opposed to that section of the body that is where the bleeding comes from. The other area, which I know the UAE, Qatar, all these countries may or may not know of, is isotope manufacturing. South Africa is the leading manufacturer of isotopes across the globe, and isotopes are critical for nuclear medicine, radiotherapy, and of course the sterilization of medical equipment. So by way of one particular industry that needs to be focused on moving into the future is the value chain in healthcare. And then I want to conclude this around, whilst people may say mining in South Africa or mining in Africa is not the place to go, but from an expertise point of view, earth sciences and geosciences has to be an area that we look at. Today, the Congo produces the world's greatest percentage of cobalt. Rwanda, Ethiopia, and Mozambique are tantalum producers. And I could, of course, go on, but more about that later. So for me, using nanotechnology and isotopes when it comes to food security and food production across the continent, because isotopes is not only used in medicine, it's also used in energy and in agriculture. So just a punt at the moment for those industries that you would not necessarily associate Africa and Southern Africa with.
Sure. Very interesting, given the importance of food security to the Middle East region as well. That's right. There's quite a variety there. And if I could come to you, Moji, on this one, you had particular interest in a couple of other areas, a couple of other sectors that you're seeing develop.
Yes, and indeed, Africa has always had oil and gas initiatives and ventures and partnerships in the Middle East. But rather than focusing on the drilling and the mining, we're now looking at transactions on the infrastructure. I know that there are refinery projects going on in Africa at the moment. There are pipeline on some of this oil and gas transactions, pipeline deals open for investments. But particularly now with the pandemic, you're seeing a new area coming up in the area of infrastructure, education, with immobility of students to go traditionally to Europe and the Middle East to study. We're seeing deals of student accommodation where students stay in country and they have accommodation where they can log on from their home countries into institutions in the United States, into institutions in the UK, in Saudi, in Dubai. And we're finding there's an increase in demand for investments in education, anything that has to do with online education. The pandemic is still around, especially in countries like the UK, where I'm sitting at the moment, total lockdown, and term has started. And we're finding that a lot of entrepreneurs are approaching us and asking us on how we can help facilitate funding between those two regions where the schools may be in a different area and the students are physically in one sector. Another area that we are getting quite a lot of demand for funding, especially in infrastructure, in international funding, is in manufacturing. We have demand for shea butter, for example, from African countries, and the raw materials are there, and they're looking for funding for scaling up and helping the raw materials to be put in standards that are acceptable to end users and off-takers in various developed markets. So we're seeing a huge demand in manufacturing, education, of course, medical, in the health sectors, especially from Africa, with the vaccine, structures need to be put in place that the vaccine can be administered properly. And we're seeing a demand from governments. We need help to be able to store some of these vaccines properly and in conditions that can be administered safely. Thank you.
Thank you. Again, quite interesting, because there was a spate of educational establishments growing up in the UAE in particular. I think there were about 25 or 30 that were established in the 5 years I was living there. And it's interesting to see now it's been mixed with the digitization and the fact that you don't have to have the physical establishment to do it in country, but you can take advantage of technology to get you to the same place and cover those more remote areas as well. I think linked with the sector analysis is obviously the geographies. And Rob, perhaps you could say a few words on specifically where you see the geographies doing well over the coming 2 or 3 years.
Yeah, Simon, I mean, historically, you're looking at geographical or cultural similarities. Initially, much of the investment and trade flows were with the North African region in the Middle East, and indeed, Middle Eastern companies using North Africa as a hub to then go into sub-Saharan Africa. Similarly, on a geographical level, we've seen the Horn of Africa being a major focus point for Middle Eastern companies. I've already mentioned the competition almost between Gulf countries to establish port and aviation interests in the Gulf. And this is really where we're seeing most of the activity at the moment. Places like Sudan, Ethiopia, Kenya to a certain extent are all seeing more and more activity on this south-south trade corridor. But really these days, and as Judy and Moji also mentioned, it's the sectors are becoming more diverse, but the countries too. And now we're seeing investment from the Gulf going as far as South Africa in the south, or more to the west in places like Ghana and Nigeria. So there's almost no more. There's no list of exceptions anymore, and you really can see more and more of the south-south trade corridor opening up more parts of the continent to Middle Eastern trade and investment.
Sure, and the obvious proximity of East Africa was the obvious starting point for looking in. But maybe you could follow up on that a little bit. You're obviously usually based in the UAE. When you talk to potential investors in the region, what do they naturally gravitate towards, and is that changing?
So out of our office in Dubai, we service originated deals from our office in Lagos. And we're seeing a huge demand for transactions in the West African region. Cameroon, we're working on some deals. We're working on quite a lot of government deals with the Nigerian governments, with Nigerian parastatals that need international funding, either on a trade basis or a long-term funding basis. We're getting quite a lot of demand for Kenyan deals from the international funders. We have about 3 or 4 Kenyan deals, so there's some activity there. Right now, in the middle of the pandemic, a huge focus on yield, so where they can get the yield vis-a-vis the sectors. So we're seeing investment gravitate towards those economies where they can get good yields. I think Nigeria is interested in that radar. Ghana, you see some deals from Zimbabwe that are giving good yields, and investment is certainly gravitating towards those regions.
It's interesting. I think, Rob, you mentioned earlier about diversification. Perhaps I could come to first Judy and then you to get your thoughts. 2020 was obviously a difficult year for many places around the world. Africa was no different. Sort of on a generalization basis, the economies that seemed to do better were those that had more diversification in them. Is that how you saw it, Judy? And do you see that becoming an increasing part of African economies?
I think it's risk mitigation, which is key. So whatever you do, I just want to give you an example. I mentioned that I was in a tourism infrastructure integrated company, and we had a strategy around X percentage Africa, X percentage Europe, India, America, and the Caribbean, so that if there were terrorist attacks or crime, you could then beef up your bottom line with your investments in Europe or in India or in America or South America. Of course, tourism has taught us that that whole idea of de-risk and diversification of markets does not often hold, but COVID, God forbid, is unique and will never happen to us again. So if I just talk about diversification and de-risking and what strategies you have in place, I think, none of us had that crystal ball. But what is very important is if you looked at the UAE emoji and the presence of the airlines in South Africa, and now you look at what has happened in aviation, we can't move in Africa at the moment because Emirates is not flying. So I say that quite, it's metaphoric, but at the same time, now if you need to move, you use Kenyan Airlines, which is a solid airline. Rwandan Airlines is not flying the way they used to, nor is Ethiopian Airlines. So obviously, coming back to what are the opportunities, I think there are tremendous opportunities for consolidation when it comes to airlines, airlift policy, and hub policy, because all of this is being redefined. What is very important, and we had won the World Cup, the next World Cup bid, and we play big in sport. So, of course, African expertise was being deployed in the UAE, but I really think the opportunity now is to put aside prejudice, unconscious bias, and really look for the expertise. What is best in class? What is world class? And then you bring those case studies and those brains together to really redesign how you move forward. Global supply chains is, of course, one of the big opportunities around diversification. COVID has taught this to us again, that if you can only move freight, what freight are you going to move? Just around food. I mean, at the moment, you cannot, if you look at the prices of ginger, garlic, turmeric, Africa and the Middle East is big on, yes, there's Western medicine, but we also go to indigenous knowledge. So today, I mean, where I live, to get your hands on garlic and ginger, you're paying a premium price. So how do you move the spices around the world? So Africa playing into global supply chain and value chain, which comes to a digitized procurement system. Logistics has to be rock solid. And then, of course, what IORA has been working on tirelessly without much recognition, the Indian Ocean Rim Association, and that is how do you liberalize your trade agreements and how do you modernize it and how do you modernize it? Because if your entry point is on shipping, when you're using your ports, then there is the opportunity that's been spoken about from a port harmonization point of view and dry docking, because if the planes can't fly, then you're going to rely on shipping. So I do hope I've answered your question with sufficient nuance and texture, Simon.
Certainly, Judy. I think just before moving on, we've had a couple of questions in from the audience around this topic of sectors and geographies and value chains. The question is, much of the focus on boosting African trade seems to be around improving value chains. Is there a role for Dubai, and I suppose we can widen it to the wider Middle East, to play in improving the value chain for Africa? Would anybody like to comment on that?
Let me go for it while I'm still hot on the press. I think absolutely, because the last time I went to Dubai was for the AIM, the annual investment meeting, and all of you would know that AIM moved from a pure kind of property portfolio offering to looking at fintech, to looking at startups. So again, as new technologies evolve, and boy, oh boy, are we seeing some technologies evolve, tectonic shifts in technology. And I think what the UAE can play with some of its maybe spare cash, and I think there's an inordinate amount of spare cash, is really look at Africa around what some of our startups are doing. There's always been a natural affinity because geographic and religion and custom affinities. But when you start looking at what some players are doing around drone technology, using drones to move, because if we can't move, then allow the drones to move, to do drops. Of course, and some unbelievable technologies in the telecommunication space, because that is the future. If we are going to work more remotely and more offline and online, then if you don't have spectrum and the allocation of spectrum, and how do you capitalize on that spectrum to then bring people fast, accessible, reliable connectivity. But some of our, we have a demographic dividend in Africa. And when you look at our cohort of, say, young people between the ages of 18 and 25, is to really, really look at what's happening in these spaces and inject the capital so that you can have a two-way flow in terms of what Africans are doing. I mean, we produce rocket fuel for NASA as Africa. So there's no shortage of unbelievable intellectual capital on the continent of Africa. What often is lacking is, if you look at Tesla and what he did with Reddit, buying and Bitcoin, that is a South African. Couldn't do what he wanted to do in Africa and then went to other markets. And we need to stop that brain drain. Keep our capital here, keep our intellectual capital here, and trade globally.
Very interesting. I'm conscious of time, so I'd like to move on to the next topic, which that leads into quite nicely, which is around the UAE and the Middle East becoming a hub for this business. And Jay, if I could come to you, what do you think is behind the, relatively speaking, astronomical growth in the Middle East market, generally UAE in particular, in terms of moving up the investment scale and doing business with other regions, Africa and Asia in particular? What do you feel is driving that and has resulted in the success they've had?
Thank you, Simon. See, in my view, what has really helped the region is the fact that the leaders of UAE have had the foresight in terms of really looking at what is the strategic advantage UAE plays in the global ecosystem of supply chain. UAE is very strategically located. Obviously, it is in the crossroads of where the majority of the demand is, and then of late, and obviously last couple of decades, the majority of the growth and business has actually happened in China and quite large extent India. So those have been the large consumers of goods or raw materials, and eventually those goods have to be shipped back to various parts of the world. Where is the largest opportunity in terms of the market space? And clearly, Africa is one such large marketplace where there is demand, obviously, and then so the demand and supply actually is getting met through UAE being the central point altogether in terms of delivering that logistics to facilitate the trade between where the goods are needed and where the goods are getting supplied from. Now, how this actually has evolved is that obviously the UAE leaders have actually DIFC is one, the Dubai Investment Park, which is in Dubai, and of course ADGM, Abu Dhabi Global Markets in Abu Dhabi. These two entities have been the central pillars in terms of how this model has actually delivered. And predominantly, the concerns usually come from the fact that what is the regulations and how actually these trades can be facilitated with least amount of hurdles in terms of the delivery, how the regulations actually facilitate trade and not create obstacles in terms of the delivery. Next piece of is and that's what's being delivered through DIFC and ADGM. Then there's the logistic piece where how goods are actually going to move, and if you do not have an integrated logistic system, which not only has the airport, the logistic containers, and its movement, all of this cannot be actually delivered. Jebel Ali Free Trade Zone, the port there is ninth largest port in the world, facilitating the movement of goods. So what in essence what Dubai has or UAE has actually done is put that ecosystem in place that actually facilitates and improves the transaction flows, and obviously in that process connecting Africa to the world and the world to the Africa as well.
Sure. Moji, obviously you have presence in the UAE. There are obviously practicalities of doing business. If you're an African business looking for Middle East investment, what are the practicalities around going in to actually attract the right investment from that region?
Just practically speaking, we have an office in Dubai, Woodhull Capital. I must say that every single young person in my office is extremely excited to go to Dubai. They're wonderful hosts. There's a lot to do. So practically speaking, looking at the resource that we have in our offices, I think every single person, when we open the office, very, very happy to go. Wonderful weather, nice life, and you can balance that. The translation between moving from Africa and living in the Middle East. Dubai is a nice landing spot. There's an entrepreneurial spirit. I find when you come to our offices in Dubai, we're having meetings and people are available to talk now. So you're able to get a lot done in a very short space of time. You're able to meet a lot of people, speak. There's no time barrier. Businesses in Dubai are available to have meetings on the same day as you meet them or the next day. And so there's that energy, and there's that energy that passes on to people who come into Dubai. Our offices are based in DIFC. We're always meeting banks and other corporates in there. We're thinking of opening something in ADGM. And we see our role as influencers on African transactions. And as Judy said, keeping our talent in Africa, but dealing globally and having offices that are our parent company is in Africa. And we are dealing globally with all the global investors and going in and out from Africa into those regions to discuss business, to take transactions and put them in the mainstream and put them in the purview of all the various investors that may be looking at transactions in Africa. The interesting thing is we're also finding a small group of African businesses that have decided to open rep offices in Dubai, and we are actually facilitating deals for those African businesses that are onshore, like us, who have offices in Dubai, and we are helping facilitate transactions, bespoke transactions, coming up with new products, like I was doing this morning with one of the biggest oil companies out of Nigeria who have an office in Dubai, and trying to find a bespoke product between them and some of the banks in Dubai. So we are sitting down and we are crafting and carving out new structures that could work out of what's existing or out of the traditional ways of doing business. So I think just from a practical perspective, take your vision, take your transactions, go and sit with the decision makers in Dubai, and you'd find that there is a lot of interest and you will get a lot from those interactions. And if you need any further facilitation, Woodhull, we're right there in DIFC. You can always contact us. But those conversations are going on, and I think they'll continue to go on between African businesses and the Middle Eastern investors. Thank you.
Thanks, Moji. Unfortunately, Judy has to leave us shortly. Judy, is there anything you wanted to say before you signed off?
Yes, if I may. I think it would be remiss of us not to focus in on the game changer for Africa, and that is the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. So I'd like to leave that thought with you, that trade is a force for good and properly harnessed can help lift millions out of poverty, which we must do for future sustainability. Women stand to gain through the African Free Trade Agreement, and I'd like to leave you with this this statistic. 70% of informal cross-border trade in Africa is conducted by women, and trade integrity moving into the future will be at the center stage. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you very much.
I'm available by email if there are any other questions. Thank you.
Thank you. And just picking up on that point, Rob, part of the whole idea of the free trade agreement and the sort of government role in this is the establishment of government-to-government relationships. How have you seen that working? Obviously, we have the free trade agreement themselves, but there will be other aspects to it.
Thank you, Simon. Yeah, I'm really glad Judy brought up this point about the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. For people who don't know what it is, this is an agreement which is currently being implemented after some delays last year due to the pandemic, signed on by almost all African countries and being ratified, and it will create the world's largest free trade union. At the moment, African intra-regional trade is almost negligible compared to the exports from the continent. And here is a real opportunity. First of all, there was a question earlier about value creation. And here there's a real opportunity here to boost that expertise which is needed for value creation by opening up borders, land borders particular, between African countries, and to allow skills and expertise to flow across borders and to build into what is very often, particularly from an export point of view, still very much driven by extractive sectors. And therefore, as we're now seeing commodity prices resurge with a real impact for Africa, there's an opportunity here to tie into and beneficiate the value chain for sectors such as mining and oil and gas and soft commodities. And in terms of your tie-on question there, this can only really work once governments start talking to other governments and start resolving key issues that have been implementation hurdles or obstacles to the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. Example is, for example, that Nigeria, which had its borders closed with its neighbors for most of last year, has now reopened them under some restrictions because of the Continental Free Trade Agreement. But others need to do so as well, particularly in East Africa, where there remain political issues between countries which are still keeping borders shut. And of course, the lockdowns and the pandemic and travel restrictions are also keeping many borders and travel corridors shut. So there's a real boost at the moment, driven by the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, to eradicate these type of travel restrictions, to open up land borders, and to facilitate mediation and negotiations between governments, from which then indeed trade can tie on and see longer-term beneficiated benefits.
And I think an interesting question that I had, which actually has also been raised by somebody in the audience, is obviously once the free trade agreement is really up and running and boosting the economies, to what extent do you think that may have an adverse impact on the South-South trade with the Middle East and into Asia? Do you think there will be an effect, or is it a case of there being sort of the pie increasing overall? Jay or Rob, if you'd like to comment.
Yeah, absolutely. I see this as an opportunity. More intra-Africa trade does not create a situation where the rest of the world will obviously get marginalized. It only creates more opportunities for the rest of the world to actually be a participant in that process. Now, Dubai, obviously, Dubai meaning UAE, Africa flows have actually grown about 11% year on year for the last few years. Non-oil exports of UAE actually are about 4.2%, much higher than the previous averages, which were lower than 3%. And this free trade agreement is actually going to to extrapolate that growth altogether, because of the fact that more trade between the regions would allow more freer movement of goods, which then would actually expedite or increase the volumes of trade that happens with the rest of the world. So it's a huge opportunity for the world, and the success of Africa is an equal success for the rest of the world to follow.
Thanks, Jay. Moji, Rob, did you have anything to add to that before I move on?
I'm just talking about products in Africa. Again, we're seeing partnerships between firms like ours who are on ground in Dubai, looking at investment factoring opportunities where the actual products the investors are comfortable with, but they may not actually know enough about the region, and would isolate those kind of transactions and give comfort in the products that they're interested in. And so factoring would discount receivables in products that the Middle Eastern investors are comfortable with, and so would isolate that and provide solutions, funding solutions to corporates and banks in Africa. So there are different sort of structures, products, financial innovations going on, and I think that helping to develop that could be very interesting on all sides.
Thanks, Moji. And the last bit I wanted to look at before we go to the final aspect of the session is looking at India and China, which was touched on very briefly by Robert at the beginning of the session. There's a question that's come in from the audience, which is, does the panel feel that China is winning the exports and imports game when it comes to Africa? And what's the view? And perhaps you could come back on that in the context of the flows that you're seeing coming from China and India, and what investments into the continent you're seeing. Jay, if I could come to you first.
Yeah, see, what I have actually noticed being physically present in Africa and parts of Africa with this huge amount of chunks of land that China is actually using for the agribusiness. And that's obviously something that has helped facilitate a lot of consumption needs in mainland to be promoted, and exports happening out of China itself, out of Africa itself. Now, that's one part of the overall how China has actually used or the opportunities that are present in terms of the goods that from the extraction that they could actually do out of Africa. But I think it would be wrong to say that it was just China winning that battle altogether. The region itself obviously gained out of those investments, and it's the overall pie that this opportunity brought in obviously facilitated a lot of growth and investments in Africa, which otherwise would not have actually happened. So it's a win-win game. I do see that obviously China would have benefited in certain senses, but it gave employment, it gave the infrastructure to much needed, that is much needed in Africa as part of the overall exchange, which then has helped facilitate China and Africa to grow together.
Thanks, Jay. Robert or Moji, did you have any thoughts?
Just a quick one, where we've always talked about China and Africa, but I think we have to be talking more about Asia and Africa these days. Because if you look at China's role on the continent, it's no longer as entrenched as it was, let's say, 10 years ago, with many of the massive credit facilities to major economies like Angola and Ethiopia having expired and not being renewed. And these countries actually now going to multilaterals and commercial credit rather than only to China. And similarly, we've seen a number of African countries saying no to China. And this has happened on a number of times in terms of big infrastructure investments, which were indeed rejected or cancelled from places from Sierra Leone to Tanzania to South Africa. So it's no longer the entrenched dominance that China was perceived to have. It's now much more of a competition with other Asian countries, amongst others. So it's certainly no longer the China-Africa argument as before.
Do you think that that's for a specific reason? Obviously, there's been a lot of talk over the years about the way China carries out its infrastructure work on the continent, or is it just a general ramping up of the competition?
I think it's a requirement for different expertise. And leaving to one side the various different stories that you're referring to, I think it's very much the requirement for African countries that they now need different types of expertise, which China does not always provide, and also that they are now in a market position where they can pick and choose. And there's a competition these days in place like Angola, where before very few people wanted to go into. Now there are far more people queuing, waiting, competing to enter, and Angola can pick and choose. So it's no longer just China that's looking to invest in countries which were left out by many Western partners. There's far more, there's a broader spectrum at the moment. Thanks, John.
Moji, your light lit up. Did you have anything you wanted to add to that?
Yes, I just wanted to say I totally agree with Rob. We're seeing, especially female entrepreneurs, looking at other Asian countries and looking at different products that are not traditionally the beauties of international banks, and they're looking at different avenues, family trust offices. And as Judy said, and I think I have to continue to represent women on this panel, there's a lot of trade going on with African women. A lot of them are entrepreneurs running their own businesses, and they are looking far and further afield than China. I know many women, when they started their businesses, would head to China automatically, but we're seeing Turkey coming up very strongly on the global travels. And we in Woodhull Capital and talks with the Turkish Exim, for example, helping us to attract investment into Africa with the Islamic Development Fund. And so there's a lot of spotlight and searchlight on investors that would work and add expertise, as Rob was saying. And there's different things that African entrepreneurs are looking for at the moment. And so it's going beyond China, and the market is open to investors that are female friendly. Thank you.
Thanks, Moji. I'm very conscious of time, so I just wanted to finish up with one quick question for each of the three of you. Which is the magic wand question. If there was one thing you could do or change in order to have a significant positive effect on trade flows through this South-South corridor, what would it be? Perhaps I can start with you, Rob.
Sure. I think that it needs to be a drive towards economic diversification. And just very briefly, we are now talking about a potential commodity super cycle again in Africa, where many African countries may fall into the same trap again as they've done before. So crucial to look for different expertise from the Gulf, for example, to drive new sectors, new industries, and boost that intra-regional trade to diversify rather than yet again rely on a single commodity.
Thanks, Rob. Jay?
I would say expedite this free trade agreement. Obviously, more countries and more and infrastructure that gets built around different countries to be able to exchange goods and services much more freely would obviously ensure that the African continent actually benefits from the entire opportunity. We talked about China, we talked about India. Obviously, the fact remains that when there's a proper mechanism that helps facilitate trade a lot more, there you will have various different other continents and countries participating in the growth. So obviously, this is the most critical aspect for me to make this happen.
Okay, thanks, Jay. And to see us out, Moji?
I would say the Middle Eastern investors should please keep an open mind from their traditional partners in Africa. Look at the midstream banks, the mid-tiered banks in Africa, who are actually bringing on more interesting structures, more interesting transactions on. The old rule of the top 5 banks in Nigeria, the top 5 banks in Kenya wouldn't work if you're really looking at getting innovative transactions on. Look to the level after that, and they're bringing some of the most interesting structures. You have some of the best talents in the markets working with some of those investors, some of those banks, and they could be partners beyond funding. They could actually help make an inroad deeper into the African continent. That's what I would say. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Moji. Nice way to finish. So that's the end of our session today. I trust you found it useful. Certainly, I've learned a few things during the course of the session. It just remains for me to thank the panel and to thank GTR for giving the opportunity for us to all participate in the conference, and to thank you, the audience, for joining us.